So this is part 2 of the video lectures for chapter 3, and we're going to cover everything related to the demand side of the market. The demand is the consumers, right? Those are the people that are actually purchasing the goods and services. And what you need to understand is there's a difference between the total demand for a product versus the quantity demanded of a product. So if we're talking about the demand for a product right here, we're talking about the total amount demanded at all price levels. Whereas if we are talking about quantity demanded, we're talking about the quantity that will be purchased at a specific price. So two different things. Demand is the total amount that will be purchased taking all price levels into consideration, whereas quantity demanded is just the specific amount that will be purchased at a specific price in the market. So you want to make sure that you understand the difference between the two. Now graphically, I can show you a difference between what demand would look like versus quantity demanded. In other words, if I asked you to identify the demand for a good on a graph, you would be pointing out the entire demand curve. In other words, because the entire demand curve takes into account every single price level. Whereas if I asked you to point out just the quantity demanded, that's when you're going to look at what quantity demanded is at a specific price. So looking at this graph, if I said what is quantity demanded when the price is $3, you would come over here, look for the price of $3, and then see what the corresponding quantity demanded is when the price is $3. And so what we can see is that the quantity demanded when the price is $3 is 30 units of the good. So again, graphically, quantity demanded is a point along the curve, whereas demand for the good is the entire curve. Now on the previous lecture slide, we saw the slope of the demand curve was negative. In other words, there was an inverse relationship between price and quantity. So I can go ahead and reconstruct that right here where we see we have price on this axis and we have quantity on this axis, and our demand curve generally is downward sloping like so. So in other words, if the price was up here at $5, hypothetically we can say quantity demanded is 1, whereas if the price drops all the way down here to $1, we can say maybe quantity demanded increases to 10. So again, we're seeing that as the price is falling, the quantity demanded is increasing, or we can go vice versa. When the price is rising, the quantity demanded is decreasing. We refer to this as the law of demand. Again, according to the law of demand, as the price of the good goes up, the quantity we're going to purchase is going to decrease, and vice versa. Now, in order for the law of demand to hold, everything else related to the demand of that product must not be changing. In other words, we know that price alone is not what influences us to buy goods and services. There's a lot of other factors. So all of the other factors related to our demand for a good can't be changing, otherwise the law of demand does not hold. So for example, if the price of apple decreases, will the quantity demanded increase or decrease according to the law of demand? Well, we can see right here, if this was our graph for apples and the price decreased, so let's say apples went from $5 down to $1, we could clearly see that we went from wanting to purchase 1 apple to wanting to purchase 10 apples. Therefore, the quantity demanded was increasing. Now, the demand did not increase, the quantity demanded increased. In order for demand to increase, quantity demanded would have to be changing at every price level, which basically means our entire curve is shifting. But in this case, if there's just a price change of a good, that's just going to alter the quantity we demand. Now let's define the different factors other than price that cause us to demand a good in the first place. Because recall, in terms of the definition of the law of demand, I said all of the other factors related to demand have to be held constant. So what are those factors? In other words, think of the goods and services that you purchase. If you're purchasing a good, that means you demand it in the market. What is it that's causing you to purchase those goods? Where did your demand come from? So we have 5 primary factors that influence people's demand for goods and services. The first factor generally we refer to is just simply your income, right? The amount of money that you have is going to determine what kind of demand you have for different goods and services. So income makes sense as to why that's going to be a very important determinant of demand. So think of something like a Ferrari. I may really like Ferraris, however, I can't actually demand a Ferrari. In other words, I'm not actually ever going to buy one because I don't have the income to purchase a Ferrari. So income is, of course, one of the primary determinants of demand. Another determinant of demand that's obviously really important is just our consumer taste and preferences. In other words, what we actually like. We're not going to purchase goods and services that we dislike. So our taste and preferences will influence, what we actually demand, what goods and services we actually want to purchase. A third determinant of demand would be consumer expectations. And so this is a fairly broad category, but our expectations can have an impact on what goods and services we actually purchase. In other words, let's say I normally demand bananas. I really like to eat bananas. However, I turn on the morning news and I see that bananas have been infected with a deadly virus. Well, now my expectations have changed. I think if I eat bananas, I may get sick. Therefore, I'm less likely to demand bananas now. So our expectations can influence our demand for goods and services. Another determinant of demand is the price of related goods and services. So in other words, let's say I demand a particular type of good, but I don't necessarily have any kind of brand loyalty. Then that means that as the price of the related goods changes, the demand for the initial good may be altered. In other words, if I'm, deciding between buying Colgate or Crest toothpaste, if the price of one of those changes, that will probably cause me to just purchase the less expensive good. So as the prices of related goods and services change, that's also going to alter our demand for the goods. And then the last determinant of demand that we usually refer to is simply the number of buyers in the market. The more buyers there are, the more demand there's going to be for a good or service, versus the smaller the number of buyers there are, the lower the demand for the good or service is going to be. So what I want to do now is actually go over each one of these determinants of demand more specifically to see what actually happens to the demand for a good when one of these determinants of demand changes. So let's look at the determinant of demand for income first. So we construct our demand curve for a good. We have price on this axis, quantity on this axis, and of course our demand curve is downward sloping. Now let's say that we have a change in income. Let's say that our income increases. Well, if our income increases, that's probably going to alter demand for goods. However, how it alters our demand depends on what type of good we're talking about. We can categorize goods into 2 categories. We have what's called normal goods, and we have what's called inferior goods. And depending on what type of good it is, that's going to impact whether your demand increases or decreases or increases. So if your income goes up and you are purchasing what we consider a normal good, then that means that your demand for that good or service is going to increase. So the demand curve would shift to the right like so, illustrating an increase in demand. So this represents normal goods and services. Whereas if your income increases and you actually decrease your demand for the good, so your demand curve actually shifts the other way, that means that the good was an inferior good. So a shift to the right, an increase in demand, illustrates a normal good versus a shift to the left it exhibits an inferior good. So for example, let's say that we were talking about the goods steak versus top ramen, right? So when our income was lower, then we would say we were consuming more of the top ramen. But then as our income increased, we were able to now purchase more of the normal good steak because we could afford it, and then decrease our consumption of the top ramen because basically we were only eating the top ramen because our income level was low. So again, we can see that when we have an increase in income, whether or not we purchase more or less of a good depends upon whether it was a normal versus inferior good. Okay, the second determinant of demand that I mentioned was just consumer tastes and preferences. And this one's pretty easy to understand. In other words, let's say we have a demand for a particular good or service. So we have our downward sloping demand curve, and we're talking about taste and preferences. So let's say, for example, we're talking about the taste and preferences for the game of golf. And we say that over time, the popularity of golf has decreased. So less people like to golf. Well, what impact does that have on the demand, for items related to golf? We would obviously say, well, because people's taste and preferences have changed to where they don't like it as much, the demand for the products has decreased. So again, as our taste and preferences change, that causes the demand for the goods and services related to that to be altered also. Now, we would go the other direction if I had said the popularity of golf has increased. If the popularity of golf had increased, then the demand curve would be shifting to the right. There would be an increase in demand for golf. But in this case, because I said the popularity of golf has decreased, that would simply mean that the demand for the good is decreasing. The third determinant of demand that I mentioned was income. Whoops, I already went over income, I'm sorry. Which one was the third one? Okay, consumer expectations. I apologize for that. So consumer expectations was our third determinant of demand. And again, this is a pretty broad category because we can be talking about all different expectations. However, we know that whenever expectations change, that does alter our demand for goods and services. So let's say we're talking about expectations related to a particular product. Let's say that I normally buy something like almonds. And I hear a report that because of the drought, they expect the price of almonds to increase in the future. Right? So I normally buy almonds, and now I just hear this report that because of the drought, they think that the price of California almonds is now going to increase. Well, what does that do to my demand today? Will that alter my demand for almonds today because of the expected price increase? Well, I would say absolutely yes. If I think that the price of almonds are going to be more expensive in the future, that's going to cause me to want to purchase more almonds today while the price is lower. So my expectations would actually increase my demand for almonds today because I expect the price to be more expensive in the future. Whereas if I had said the other thing, if I had said, they expect the price of almonds to drop in the future, then that's going to actually decrease my demand for almonds today because I would rather wait to purchase the almonds when they're cheaper in the future. So again, as our consumer expectations change, so does our demand for goods and services. All right, the fourth determinant of demand that I talked about was the price of related goods and services. And this one requires a couple of different graphs to illustrate how it impacts our demand. Now, goods can be related in two different ways. They can be what we call substitute goods or complementary goods. So let's look what happens when the price of substitute goods change first. So if we're looking at goods that are considered substitutes goods are goods that can be used in place of each other, right? So in other words, I can substitute Colgate for Crest with toothpaste. I can substitute Cheer with Tide for laundry detergent. In other words, they're goods that are basically perfectly substitutable. You can use one for the other. So let's say currently I tend to purchase Colgate toothpaste. So I can construct a demand curve for Colgate toothpaste, right? We have price on this axis, quantity on this axis. So there's my demand curve for Colgate. At the same time, we know Crest is a substitute good for the Colgate. So I can construct the demand curve for Crest also. So here's the demand curve like so. And let's say that the price of Crest actually decreases. Let's say normally Crest is $3 a tube, and at $3 a tube, the store is able to sell 100 tubes, and the price drops down to $2. So now Crest, instead of being $3, is only $2. Notice what happens when the Crest has a price change. The quantity demanded is altered. Now instead of selling 100 tubes of toothpaste, they're now selling 150. So anytime there's a price change in a product, we move up or down our demand curve. So that's what happened here. So the demand for Crest didn't change, just the quantity demanded changed because the price changed. So what happened to the demand for Colgate? In other words, I'm saying that the demand for goods will be altered when the price of a related good changes. And in this case, the substitute good had a change in the price. So we went from selling 100 tubes of toothpaste to now selling 150. Where did those additional 50 come from? They came from the market for the substitute goods. So when the price of Crest went down, that means the demand for Colgate decreased. People started buying less Colgate at every price level because they were substituting the purchase of the less expensive good Crest. And again, this would go the other way if Crest had experienced a price increase. Let's say the price of Crest actually went up to $4 a tube. Well, in that case, the quantity demanded is still changing, but it's actually decreasing. Now, instead of selling 100 tubes of toothpaste, the store may only sell 50. So we would have moved up along our demand curve, altering the quantity demanded in this example. And of course, if less people are buying Crest because it's more expensive now, that means that we can draw the conclusion that the demand for the substitute good over here, Colgate, would then be increasing. More people would be buying Colgate instead because the price of the substitute good, Crest, had increased. So again, when the price of related goods like substitute changes, that alters our demand for goods and services because we would like to substitute the purchase of the less expensive good. Now, another way that goods can be related is if they are what we call complementary goods. Complementary goods are goods that are used together. So we don't substitute them for one another. We have to use them together. So the best example I can think of for complementary goods right now would be like an iPhone and a charger. In other words, I can't use my iPhone unless I have a charger, and a charger is useless to me unless I have an iPhone. In other words, these are two goods that you have to have both in order to get use out of either one of them. So we can have construct the demand curves for both iPhones and chargers. And what we want to see is what happens to the demand for one when the other one experiences a price change. So let's say, for example, iPhones are currently $300 and they sell 100 iPhones at $300 and the price drops. The price goes from $300 to now being $200. Well, again, what we can see is the quantity demanded is altered, right? Now instead of selling 100, now perhaps they're selling 150. I'll go down here where I can fit it on here. All right, so the price drops. That caused the quantity demanded to increase. Remember, the demand doesn't increase when there's a price change, just the quantity demanded is going to increase. So iPhone price goes down, the quantity demanded goes up. We want to know, does this have an impact on the demand for chargers? Absolutely, because these are complementary goods. If more people are now buying iPhones, what that means is that the demand for chargers is now going to increase. More people are going to demand chargers at every price level because the price of the complementary good declined. And then, of course, it would be the opposite if the price of iPhones had gone up. If the price of iPhones, let's say, had increased to $400, well, then we can see that we would have moved up along our demand curve. And so let's say now only 50 people are buying iPhones. So the quantity demanded has decreased. And if less people are now purchasing the iPhone, then that would mean that the demand for the complementary good, the charger, would have actually declined. Less people would be buying chargers at every price level because of the price increase of the complementary goods. So again, whenever the price of a related good or service changes, this alters our demand for the other good. And then the last determinant of demand is simply the number of buyers in the market. And this one is fairly easy to understand. As the number of buyers in the market changes, this alters the demand for goods and services. So we start out with a demand curve just like any other good, and we see what happens when the number of buyers changes. So let's say that we're talking about something like the demand for skis here in California. And we want to know, well, what happens to the demand for skis in the summer? Well, why would it be different any other time of year? Well, you know that in the summertime, there's no snow in our local mountains to go skiing. Therefore, the number of people that are going to go skiing is going to fall, which is the same thing as saying the number of buyers in the market is going to decline. So because the number of buyers is going to decline, we would say that the demand for skis in the summertime would decrease. Whereas if we said what happens to the demand for skis in the wintertime, well, in the wintertime, our local mountains generally have snow, which means the number of buyers is going to increase. There's going to be more people wanting to buy skis. Therefore, the demand for skis would increase in the wintertime because the number of buyers in the market would increase. So again, anytime the number of buyers increases, it will increase demand, and anytime the number of buyers decreases, it will decrease demand. So just to recap here, I want to make sure that you completely understand the difference in a change in demand for a good versus a change in quantity demanded of a good. Anytime there's a change in demand, that's going to be like graph A here. In other words, the entire curve is going to shift, just like all of the examples I did for you on the previous slides. So anytime there's a change in demand, that basically means the curve shifts, and the reason why it's shifting is because there's been a change in a determinant of demand. Whereas if we're talking about a change in quantity demanded, and that's going to be graph B here, that just means there's been a price change. And there's just going to be movement along the demand curve. And so students tend to get very mixed up with that, making sure that they know the difference between a change in demand versus change in quantity demanded. Anytime a good experiences a price change, demand doesn't change, just quantity demanded changes. So that's what we're seeing here in graph B, moving from point A to B. That happened because of the fact that the price went down. Whereas when we're looking at a change in demand, that means one of our actual determinants have changed, which has actually caused the entire demand curve to shift. So make sure that you understand the difference between the two, the difference between a change in demand versus a change in quantity demanded. Now, the last thing that I want to cover in terms of the demand side of the market is simply being able to construct your demand curves, because you will be doing this a lot on your homework. So oftentimes what I do is I give you a table of information. So here we have the price and the quantity demanded, and then you have to construct the demand curve from the information in the table. So let's say that I actually give you quantity demanded for two different people in the market for a particular good. So you would actually have two different columns of data. So we have the different price points here, and then we have the different quantity demanded for the two individuals in the market. Let's say this is going to be 7, 5, 4, 3, 2. All right, so again, we could see these two individuals have two different, quantities that they demand at the prevailing price levels for the good. And then I asked you to construct the individual people's demand curve on your graph. So again, you have price and quantity like so, and all you have to do is take the data from the table and plot those points. So on this axis, we see that the price goes anywhere from $1 to $5, and then the quantity demanded goes anywhere. I'll just go all the way over here to 15. So 5 somewhere in here, 10 somewhere in here. So we'll just estimate where our points are. So let's say the first thing I wanted you to graph was the quantity demanded for this individual right here. So again, all you would do is take the data and start plotting the points. So when the price is $1, we see this person wants 5. When the price drops to $2, they now want, going the wrong direction here. All right, so again, when the price was $1 down here, they wanted 5. When the price was $2, they now wanted 4. When the price was $3, they now wanted 3, 2, and 1, something like that. And then, of course, all you would have to do is connect those dots to derive the demand curve for that individual. So there's the demand curve for our first person. Then I can do the same thing and construct the demand curve for a second person by taking the data from the table and plotting the points. So we see that when the price is $1, this person wants 7. Let's say 7's about right there. When the price drops to $2, they now want 5. When the price drops to $3, they now want 4. So it's pretty much going in line with this one like so. So here's the demand curve for the second individual, and so that's the demand curve for this information right here. And then what if I asked you to construct the market quantity demanded for the goods and services? Well, if these are the only two individuals in the market, then that means that all we have to do to construct the market quantity demanded is add these two together. In other words, so this would be the market quantity demanded here. So if person 1 wanted 5 when the price is $1 and person 2 wanted 7 when the price was $1, that means in the market there's a quantity demanded of 12. So we're just adding these. 5 plus 7 equals 12. Same thing, when the price is $2, the first consumer wanted 4, the second consumer wanted 5, therefore the market quantity demanded would be 9. You just add them together. 3 plus 4 is 7, 2 plus 3 is 5, and 1 plus 2 is 3. And then you can go ahead and plot the market quantity demanded also. So again, we would find 12 over here, then we would do 9 here, we would do 7 here, 5 here, and 3 up here. So again, we've now been able to derive not only the individual demand, but the market demand also. Market is just the sum of all of the individual demand that exists in the market. So you just have to sum the quantity demanded. So again, just to recap, each one of these points along each demand curve represents quantity demanded. Whereas when we're talking about the entire curve, that is the total demand in the market. So we've plotted both the quantity demanded and the entire demand for individual consumers and the entire market here.